The United States conducted a campaign of mass sterilization and experimentation on the women of Puerto Rico, and I want to talk about it. This story hits a little bit closer to home for me because my dad was born on the island in 1940, and I am half Puerto Rican. My ancestors were a mix of Spanish, Taino, and the enslaved Africans that were brought to Puerto Rico during the Spanish Empire. And for me, growing up in the 1980s and 90s, this idea that Puerto Ricans had way too many kids and that their population was out of control was everywhere in popular culture. It was really common. And even in the year 2021, I ran across this idea. I was with my soon to be ex husband buying a car, and it was 2021, so it was in the midst of the pandemic. So we were the only ones in this auto shop buying the car from the man who was selling it. And we were just chatting because our daughter was young and we were talking about our kids. And he said something just out of the blue about how Hispanic people don't have any trouble with fertility. Now, I'm Puerto Rican, and I was told at the age of 38 that I was infertile and that I would never be able to have my own kids. So not only was he wrong, he was racist. Let me tell you why. The United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898 as a part of its campaigns during the Spanish-American War. At the time, Puerto Rico was a part of the Spanish Empire, and the United States invaded and took it over from Spain. And almost as soon as the United States had taken over Puerto Rico, they started to see the Puerto Ricans as a problem. The colonial governor of Puerto Rico, 2 years after the invasion, was quoted as saying that there were too many Puerto Ricans on the island and that it was a problem that there were all these poor people and not enough men of capital. With the colonization of Puerto Rico, there was a huge economic shift on the island. Wealthy corporations came from the mainland and started buying up small family farms that had been in the hands of small farmers for centuries and started turning them into sugarcane plantations. So the people who owned those small farms were now out of work. They flooded into the cities, and the unemployment rate in Puerto Rico rose. None of that was the fault of Puerto Ricans, but the excess population, as it was called, was seen as a problem. As early as the 1930s, the U.S. imposed government of Puerto Rico made population control a priority. But I want to distinguish between population control and birth control. Birth control is when you give individuals information about ways that they can do family planning. You give them options, you make those options available and inexpensive for them to avail themselves of, and you insist on fully informed consent for anything that the person decides to do. Birth control is things like the pill, it's things like vasectomies, it's things like abortion. It is an essential part of healthcare and should be a part of everyone's healthcare everywhere in the world. But birth control is not the same as population control. Population control is when you target a specific sector of the population that you deem to be undesirable and decide as a government that that population should not be having children. The women of Puerto Rico were targeted because they were poor, because they were black, because they didn't speak English, because they were considered to be undesirable. They were a vulnerable population, but they were within the United States borders, so that made them easy targets for this campaign. The main method of mass sterilization that was used by the United States government on the women of Puerto Rico was tubal ligation, or as they call it on the island, la operación, which we call colloquially in the U.S. mainland tube tying. This operation was really sold to the women of Puerto Rico. It was really pushed on them. It was not forced in most cases, but it was coerced in the sense that women who had this operation were not told fully what it was. A lot of women didn't know that this is the procedure that they were getting. A lot of women didn't know that the procedure was permanent. They thought they would be able to go back and have more kids later on. They weren't given a whole lot of time to consider whether it was something that they wanted to do. They would be told that this was something that they should do. They would agree, and then a couple days later, they would have this operation. As many as 1/3 of women in Puerto Rico had this procedure at its highest point. It wasn't just when women went to their doctor's office that they were told that they should be sterilized. They were told at their workplaces. They had programs where clinics would be set up in the factories where these women worked, where they could go and be counseled on how they should have the sterilization procedure. Can you imagine? You're at your workplace. You feel obligated to do what your employer is telling you to do, and your employer doesn't want to have to pay for maternity leave, so he's asking you to go and get sterilized. This is an immense amount of pressure, especially in a place where the unemployment rate is so high, and a lot of times the women who worked at these factories were the sole breadwinners for their families. The other piece of the mass sterilization story in Puerto Rico is, of course, the fact that the birth control pill was tested on the women of Puerto Rico without them fully knowing what was being tested. They were given the original formulation of the birth control, which was an extremely high dose of just estrogen, which they found out through this experimentation on the women of Puerto Rico that if you give this extremely high dose of just estrogen, you have a huge amount of very severe side effects. They were incredibly sick. They would faint. They would pass out. They wouldn't be able to hold food down. They had all sorts. They had blood clots. People did not survive this experiment, and they were not fully informed as to what it was that they were taking. And the drug companies that really wanted to make this birth control pill played fast and loose with the lives of the women of Puerto Rico. So they didn't choose Puerto Rico to test the birth control pill on accident. They chose Puerto Rico to test the birth control pill, first of all, because the population was vulnerable, and so they could put this experiment over on them, but also because Puerto Ricans were seen as undesirable and were seen as undeserving of having children. So in the 1970s, this campaign of mass sterilization, of population control in Puerto Rico had been going on for 40 years. It was very effective in the sense that the birth control rate had dropped and huge numbers of women in Puerto Rico had been sterilized without fully informed consent. However, in the 1970s, there was huge economic issues in Puerto Rico. The unemployment rate was very high, inflation was high. So it's almost as if the economic problems that Puerto Rico had were not just because of population. It's almost as if those problems began and end with the disenfranchisement of the Puerto Rican people by the United States. In 1980, one of the main architects of the mass sterilization campaign in Puerto Rico moved to the South Bronx to become the head of one of the main public hospitals' Department of Obstetrics. And there were mass protests to remove him because the people of the South Bronx did not want the same targeted mass sterilization that had happened in Puerto Rico to happen on the mainland as well. But the reality is, sterilization, forced, coerced, happened on the mainland of the United States as well, just not on the scale of Puerto Rico. It happened to Mexican women in LA who were forced to sign paperwork they didn't understand during C-sections so that they could be sterilized after the C-section. It happened to Black women. It happened to women who are considered to be disabled, who were considered to be promiscuous. It was done to poor women here and there throughout the country by men who thought that they knew better, who thought that they should be the ones to decide who gets to reproduce, who's worthy of being a mom.